Hello, welcome to the first in a series of videos over the coming weeks by the Ontario 360 project, a project hosted at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy to elevate the public policy discourse in the province of Ontario in general, and in the lead up to the forthcoming provincial election in particular. My name is Sean Speer. I'm the project co-director of Ontario 360, and I'm joined by Drew Fagan, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and my project co-director. And our other guest is Darrell Bricker, who's the global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs and a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And he's the author of the first transition briefing memo that we'll be publishing over the course of this series, entitled "The Issues That Will Drive the Next Ontario Election." Drew and I are grateful to have Darrell participating in this year's series by Ontario 360, and in particular to be able to talk to him today about some of the key issues that he thinks will animate this year's election campaign. Thanks so much, Darrell, for contributing to our series and taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on with you.
Let's just start big picture. There's so many issues right now in the news, from the global pandemic, of course, to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Can you just give us some insight into how the Ontario electorate is feeling about the state of the province, the state of the country, and maybe their own personal circumstances?
Well, I think what we always try to do is look at these things through a political lens, and we'll get to defining that lens in a second. But I think sometimes it's worthwhile to just step back and look at how Ontarians are feeling about their lives today. And given everything that you just pointed to, I would describe the public opinion environment in Ontario today as fragile. People are feeling like there's a lot of change going on out there. They're feeling very uncertain about the future. I mean, you just mentioned the war in Ukraine. We have a huge Ukrainian population, obviously, in Ontario. But leaving that aside, just looking at just the lack of certainty about what the future is going to be like is weighing on the minds of people in this province. And where you really see it in very direct terms is when it comes to living with the pandemic and where all of that is going to go. And also what we're seeing these days in terms of people's level of uncertainty and discomfort with the economy and where they're going to be sitting in this future economy and what they can rely on. And what's really become animated in this discussion is everything related to the cost of living, primarily with housing, but also with many other aspects of just getting by from day to day. So things that seemed fairly stable and reliable, even 2 years ago, prior to this pandemic starting, now seem volatile to the public. And that volatility is leading them to be in a fragile position.
You refer to it, I think, that set of issues broadly as something you refer to as middle-class progress. Do you want to just elaborate on this idea of middle-class progress and what it is that people are expressing to you and your team in the polling that you've carried out?
Yeah, there was always, I mean, the easiest way to look at this is the kind of the Horatio Alger type analysis where it's, we're going to bootstrap my way to the top and this generation will always do better than the previous generation. That really left around the late 1980s. I mean, It's not really about that anymore. It's not about this feeling that you're going to do better than your parents or whatever. It's people looking at their own lives and feeling like they just can't get ahead. It's not in comparative terms, it's in the real terms of what their personal expectations are about where they thought their lives were going to be and where their lives are. The one issue that you can really hold out as being, I guess, an icon of this is housing and what people feel about their ability to even buy a house in the neighborhood that they grew up in and the impossibility of doing that these days. And that is really the icon of a whole series of other things that relate to this lack of personal progress. Not so much social, we can look at it as middle-class striving type progress, but it's really where I thought I was going to be in my life versus where I am.
Hmm.
And when you look at the demographic realities of what are happening in the province, say, for example, one of my favorite stats is that somebody living in the GTA, if they're under the age of 30, there's a 50% chance they're going to be living with their parents.
Hmm.
That's not something that people, that's not an environment that people felt that they were going to be living with as they were, moved past their adolescence and moved into their own personal family formation stage of their lives. We just, Ontarians, particularly the younger Ontarians, don't feel that they're able to make the type of progress that they feel that they were promised and that they feel that they're entitled to.
That's quite a statistic. Darrell, that's great. Let's go back. One of the things you do in the paper is look back at 2018 and the things that were driving voters then, and then comparing those to today. I know, the big one, I guess now, big question is the pandemic and the extent to which it may be fundamental to the election. Maybe go back to 2018 and then compare to today and what's changed and what's similar in the context of what you were just speaking about. And then we can bring it forward, I guess, to the political implications of some of the broad trends and maybe more immediate ones that we're talking about with regard to the vote on June 2nd.
Yeah, so back in 2018 is when we started to see the fragility of people and their beliefs in the future of the economy, but it wasn't as pronounced as it is today, and as I don't want to say desperate, that's the wrong word, but just the anxiety that's associated with it didn't exist back then. 2018 was very much a change election, and people felt that they could get a better life, and that things would improve by changing the government. And if you take a look in particular at what people in the 905 were thinking, and that's why the paper is so interesting, because we go back to actually the exit poll that we did.
Yeah.
It's not like your standard, interview with 1,000 people in Ontario. It's, we interviewed, I can't remember the number, it was 5,000 voters on election day, and why they voted the way that they did. And you could see it was very assertive on the policy front. They believed that they were signing up for lower energy costs. They believed that they were signing up for lower taxes. They believed that they were signing up for economic growth. They believed that they were signing up for a change in terms of the way that the province was being managed, not from a stylistic perspective, but from a policy and a substantive perspective. Energy prices were a really big part of that election. So people flipped the change switch, and they flipped it with abandon. And they believed that things were supposed to get better. But what we've now found ourselves in is an environment in which it's difficult to get better. In fact, the anxiety is worse now. The sense of progress is worse now. So that's why I describe the electorate as being volatile and fragile. Volatile is not really the word. It's that it's almost like people are feeling shattered. It's a different kind of a feeling. It's not like, oh, I'm angry and I'm going to do something. They're feeling not confident and almost shattered and fragile.
So does that fragility obviously is driven far more, driven by factors far greater than the last 2 years in the pandemic. You're talking about a generation long, trend. And I guess now I'm wondering, how does this play, or how do you think it plays with regard to the vote itself? If the fragility, that sense of dissatisfaction, is even greater now than it was in 2018, which was a change election after almost a decade and a half of Liberal rule. After one term of the Conservative government, what's the potential impact of that? Does this government, after just 4 years, wear any of that? In your evaluation? And one of the things you do, as you note in the paper, is look particularly at the 905, the band around Toronto, which federal elections as well as provincial elections is what, to most people's minds, whether won and lost.
Okay, so I think, yeah, it's really important to look at the geography of politics when we talk about politics in this province, because we sometimes lose track of the fact that politics in Canada is actually geographic.
Right.
I mean, that's the way that it works. It's about seats. It's not about votes. I mean,
yeah.
Some days there's a correlation between the two, but as we saw in the last two federal elections, there isn't always. So the reason that we talk about the 905 is not because we're particularly obsessed with the suburbs, but because the suburbs are the most volatile part of the electorate. So if we're in a volatile situation, the most volatile segment of the electorate is the 905. And the reason that that's significant is because of the size of the 905,
Right.
the number of seats. I mean, and it's not really, as I say in the paper, we incorrectly describe it as the 905. It's really car commuting communities that surround the city of Toronto. So
It's
anywhere
become bigger than the 905.
Yeah, it's bigger than the 905. You put it better than me, Drew. And so the reason that we focus on that is because when they side with downtowns, progressive parties win. When they side with smaller town, rural Ontario, the Conservative Party wins, Progressive Conservative Party wins. So they're the big swing group. So whatever is happening there is most important. And the thing about people in the 905 is they commute, they have mortgages, they don't work for the public sector to the same degree that people in downtowns do. They are people who work in the private sector. They're middle-class drivers. They're disproportionately immigrants. We think of downtowns in this country as being really multicultural. No, downtown Toronto is actually a pretty white place compared to, say, for example, Halton.
Mhm.
Or going north of the city and going up to places like Newmarket and going to the east of the city and going to places like Pickering and places they're the multicultural part of the province, the strongest multicultural part. These are middle-class drivers who are here to get their families ahead. And the question is, who connects with them? That's the political situation. Is it downtown or is it small town, rural ridings? To the extent that they connect with one or the other decides the election.
That's fascinating framing. Very insightful, Darrell. I want to come back to the question of pandemic performance and people's feelings about that. I've been struck that a lot of those conservatives in my network have been critical of the Ford government. There's a perception that it has been more restrictive than other jurisdictions. On the other hand, many in the kind of scientific community have been critical that the government has been too lax, in effect, has been too small or liberal in its public health response. How do regular Ontarians feel?
They don't know. And it was the same thing in the federal election, which is a good analogy for what we're about to go through here in Ontario. People just didn't know. And in fact, anybody who says that the management of the pandemic played a big role in the outcome of the last election hasn't looked at the numbers. I mean, the fact is that the federal government's performance numbers on pandemic management were way better than their vote numbers. And the reason was because people didn't really feel that there was much that they could do to affect the management of the pandemic, regardless of who they voted for. So what happened in the federal election was the first day of the campaign became what the campaign was about, which is, why are we having this election at all? And the cynicism that, and I'm not saying that they were being cynical, but the cynicism that the public got out of the reason that they called the election was why the election was as close as it was. So in Ontario, are we going to be doing an evaluation of the management of the pandemic? If the federal election is an analogy, I don't necessarily think that. I don't think that people have moved to any sort of political mindset at all. Right now, they're focused on what's happening in their houses, the fragility of the future, their lack of confidence in terms of what the economy is going to bring, their lack of certainty about what even whether or not they'll be able to leave their houses within the space of the next month safely and be able to go out and resume their lives. Those are the kinds of things that they're focused on, rather than the actual management, the technicalities of how the pandemic was managed. So when we move into that more political frame of mind, I think it's going to be the sense that things are getting better or worse rather than how they were managed. And if they're getting worse, then it creates problems, obviously, for all of the parties, because they need to campaign on something that in many ways is really not an ideological kind of a discussion. And by the way, the people who have the most intense views on these issues are the people who are the least representative of the Ontario public. And that's on both sides.
Drew, do you want to ask a penultimate question?
Sure. Let's go. So I guess the key question is, given all these trends and among the population and their view of their own lives and whether those are getting better or worse, the implications politically. And I suppose the question becomes, if people feel that their lives are getting worse and they blame it on a government of the day, that government's in trouble. That's not necessarily the case here, I don't necessarily think, and I'm interested in what your polling shows. I think one thing that's obvious from your polling is it explains to some extent the extent to which the Ford government, the Conservative government, has been focusing on housing in recent weeks, and the extent to which they're really trying to have an impact in terms of increasing supply and other measures, to be seen as doing something on that critical issue, which is so high on the agenda, even higher than the economy as a whole. So maybe some insights with regard to that, recognizing that some months still from the vote, it's a tricky thing to answer.
Yeah, the housing question is really interesting because people who are most interested in housing that you see in public commentary all seem to be downtown, let's make Amsterdam type people. It's all about bike lanes, green spaces, and urban density. And you know what? I'm not being critical of that, but that's the argument. The argument Ontarians are having is, when can I have a house where I can raise a family, that I can own, that I can have a driveway and I can have a backyard? I'm not in a flatting situation like I would be in Amsterdam. And this is why people live in the suburbs. So to tell them that they're not going to have that opportunity is kind of like the death of hope. Because this is the image that people have in their minds of middle class success. It's not living in a swank condo in Yorkville. That's not their view, or even living in an affordable housing project in Parkdale. That's not what they're imagining their future is going to be. They're thinking about living a reasonable commuting distance away from downtown Toronto in a house, a standalone house. That's what they want to live in. Whether that's appropriate for the environment, for transportation, for all sorts of other things, that's another question. The real question is the sense of hope that symbolically represents, that people will be able to obtain that sometime in their lives. And that's what's under threat right now. That's what the challenge is. It's not about whether or not we have enough green space in downtown Toronto, or whether we should all be riding bikes to work, or that is a downtown, very elite kind of conversation, and it will not decide the next election. It's going to be about housing supply and access to the type of housing that I've described. Whether it's the right kind of housing or not, that's what people believe that they're entitled to.
Sean, Darrell, the Australians have a great term for, people in the suburbs there, fighting to get ahead against so many challenges. Yeah. The battlers. It's a battle. Sean?
Darrell, I said that would be the penultimate question, because I wanted to ask you for your advice on what the different parties ought to be doing to speak to the mood that you described. But if I could just sneak one in before that final question. One of the things that has been the subject of debate, particularly elite debate in the context of the pandemic, is whether it will produce a net change in people's perception of the role of government in the economy and society. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is the pandemic a kind of paradigmatic moment when it comes to how people think about government, or is that sense overstated?
I think that's how people in government think about government. They think that this is their big opportunity. I don't think people have really, they look at the pandemic as not a general thing, but a specific thing. It was specifically necessary in a limited period of time for government to expand to do a very specific thing. All of a sudden, have people embraced government in a big way to build back better? No. And this is the problem you see Joe Biden having in the United States right now. People aren't, looking for more Washington and I'm here to help you. It's the same thing here. We're not looking for more Queen's Park and I'm here to help you. We're looking for smart government that focuses on the big issues, that's helpful when it needs to be helpful. But do we need a 5-year plan to, find our way through to success? No, people are very skeptical about that. So are we going to take the what worked for the pandemic and now apply it to climate change? which is what people, in the elite conversations are suggesting. No, people don't see the two things as equivalent. They just don't. One was break the glass, pull the lever, let's go out and do everything that we need to do with this specific situation. Not that we're going to be in a fire drill every 5 minutes for the next 50 years. They didn't buy into that. So what people will probably like is, as we've seen in Canadian politics, actually world politics over the years, is the pendulum will likely swing back, because the excesses of government will become the issue that people start to get concerned about. The cost of government will be the thing that they get concerned about, and the lack of government to be able to solve every problem is what they're going to be concerned about. So my sense is that people who are in government, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So they see all these nails out there and they've got their hammer and they want to start swinging away. But I don't think the public is there.
Well,
and by the way, it's not even on my thinking. My thinking doesn't matter. It's people still have confidence issues in government.
Well, let's wrap up then with just, we're roughly 90 to 100 days before E-Day. What advice would you give to the different political parties based on what your polling data are telling us about the state of the province and people's feelings and sentiments?
I would say number one, match the mood. So if you come out with some sort of a joyous celebration about the fact that we're coming slowly out of the pandemic, the public's not there. A year ago, they might have been. It was more of a, thank God this is over, I can get my life back. They're not feeling that way today. They're feeling like very tentatively, like they're sticking their heads out of the door and ready to pull back in if they need to. So they're learning to kind of live with this sort of level of uncertainty, but the mood is fragile. It's not happy days are here again. Everything is going to be wonderful now that we've left this behind us. They're feeling very tentative. So that fragility has to be matched in the campaigns. The next thing is, it is really about middle-class drivers living in the 905. Figuring out what their issues agenda is, as the Ford government did so successfully in the last campaign, and being able to connect with what that segment of the population cares about is really, really important. And the third thing is, don't listen to the extremes. They have loud voices on social media. They may even have loud voices in the media, but the public is not really listening to the people who are on the extremes, either on the left, where it's all about identity politics, or on the right, where it's all about freedom, whatever that is these days. People are still very much in that middle lane of how they think about what the country should be and what their lives are going to be, and connecting with that has the best path to success for any sort of any political campaign for any of the parties.
Well, Darrell, this has just been an absolute masterclass on polling, political analysis, and really situates the series of papers that we'll be releasing over the coming weeks to help inform party platforms in the context of the Ontario election campaign, and then, of course, the post-election transition. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Drew Fagan, I want to thank Darrell Bricker, Global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs and Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, both for speaking to us today, but also contributing to our policy brief series. People can find his first policy brief entitled "The Issues That Will Drive the Next Ontario Election" at our website, www.on360.ca. Darrell, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.